We've had discussions here on virtual book signing about the contrabands and how they fled to the Union armies and how they were used, etc. But why was the Navy so far ahead of the Army in recruiting contrabands?
Two reasons, I think. First, there had always been some African Americans in the United States Navy, unlike the Army, which had never had any blacks except emergency troops that had helped Andrew Jackson repel the British from New Orleans in 1815. But otherwise, no blacks in the United States Army, but there had been blacks in the United States Navy. The second reason is that the Navy penetrated into the areas where slavery was prominent much earlier in the war than the Army did. It was the Navy that captured the South Carolina Sea Islands and their 10,000 slaves that were left behind when the planters fled to the mainland. It was the Navy that penetrated the lower Mississippi Valley and its tributaries in early 1862. It was the Navy that penetrated the inland waterways along both the South Atlantic and the Gulf Coast. And so, and this is not really well understood, I think, there were more slaves at first, in the early months of the war, rowing their skiffs out to Union Navy ships and asking, in effect, for asylum. And the question is, what are you going to do with them? Naval captains start sending Welles some messages in the summer of 1862 saying, you know, we have on board 35 contrabands. What should we do with them? Well, Welles orders them not to send them back, to put the able-bodied men to work for the Navy, and very early on starts recruiting blacks to serve in the Union Navy in the summer of 1861. One of the gun crews on the USS Minnesota that captured Hatteras Inlet in August 1861 was consisted of former slaves.
We haven't spoken much about the combined operations and how they worked or didn't work. You write about the twin occurrences of Drury's Bluff pitting McClellan and Goldsboro, and Vicksburg with Halleck versus Farragut, where the Army would not help the Navy. But then again, Grant worked well with such officers as Foote and Farragut and Porter. How did that work or not work?
Well, some of the combined operations in the Civil War were extremely successful. Fort Donelson is one example, where the Navy tried to pin down, got a bloody nose in that case, but it still was an effective partner of Grant in the capture of Fort Donelson and the 12 or 13,000 Confederate troops that were there. The capture of Port Royal and Port Royal Bay and Beaufort, South Carolina was supposed to be a combined operation under Samuel Francis DuPont in November 1861, but as it turned out, the ships carrying the Army's ammunition had sunk in a storm, and the ships that were to tow the surf boats in for the Army to land had been forced by that same storm to seek a port and didn't get there. So the Navy had to do that one all by itself. The Navy captured New Orleans all by itself, but then the Army marched in to be the occupation troops at New Orleans. So some of the things that were designed as combined operations, Port Royal and New Orleans, turned out to be a Navy show. In other cases, as you suggest, at Drury's Bluff on James River, McClellan, Mr. Can't Be Done, General Can't Be Done, decided I don't have sufficient troops to do this, and the Navy couldn't force its way past the Confederate fortifications and obstructions there all by itself. Same thing with Vicksburg in the summer of 1862. Farragut realized that the Navy couldn't capture it all by itself. Vicksburg is a basic fortress, almost like Gibraltar. In fact, it was called the Gibraltar of the West by the Confederates. And so after Halleck had captured Corinth and had 100,000 troops, Farragut appealed to him to send some of those troops to help him capture Vicksburg in the summer of 1862, and Halleck, being the other general can't be done, said, oh, I can't spare any of the troops for this. So as a consequence, it wasn't until Grant and David Dixon Porter were able to work together in a really, I think, brilliant example of combined operations to capture Vicksburg that probably was one of the two most successful combined operations in the entire war, the other being the capture of Fort Fisher in January 1865.
We've been selling Gideon Wells's diary very well for the 41 years I've been here, and people still want to get into it. How good of a work is Gideon Wells's diary, and how useful to us today?
Well, it's extremely useful to historians.
It's one of the best lines of information into the administration.
Yes, it's chock full of rich information about the working of the Lincoln administration, and then chock full of rich information about the United States Navy during the Civil War. One issue connected with Gideon Wells's diary is that he rewrote parts of it in the years after the war with the benefit of hindsight, and so disentangling what he wrote down in 1862 or 1863 from what he wrote down later in the 1870s has been difficult.
That would make a nice monograph from you.
Well, pretty soon a new edition of Wells's diary is going to be out under the auspices of the Lincoln Studies Institute at Knox College, edited by the widow of blanking on his name. He taught at Harvard until he died of cancer a few years ago. Taught Civil War. Written a biography of Lincoln.
Too.
It'll come to me. Anyhow, she's been. He was working on a modern edition of Wells's diary that would have only the parts that he wrote at the time, and it should be out soon.
Now, Stephen Mallory, what impact did he have on the innovations and technology that certainly the South came up with, as much as the North for that matter, and helped lead at the end of '62 into '63 a resurgence of the Confederates on the water?
Well, Mallory was, I think, just as effective as a Confederate Secretary of the Navy as Welles was as the Union Secretary of the Navy. He realized from the very beginning that the Confederate Navy could never contest with the Union Navy at the same level as the Union Navy itself. It could never build enough ships, could never recruit enough men to contest with the Union Navy. So it would have to depend on technological innovation. So from almost the beginning of the war, he supported the idea of the ironclads, and the Confederacy got a leg up on converting the USS Merrimack to the Virginia as an ironclad. He also realized that the Confederacy would have to build or buy ships in Europe, and he sent James North and James Bullock and then later other agents abroad to buy or build as many ships as they could in Europe. So he was the one who really came up with that concept of the commerce raiders like the Alabama and the Florida. And he also encouraged the development of what was called torpedo technology. We'd call them naval mines today, which became the most dangerous and lethal Confederate naval weapon. They actually sank or destroyed or damaged some 43 Union naval ships, Confederate torpedoes as they were called. The Confederacy also demonstrated a lot of technological innovation with the creation of the David class of fast, semi-submerged torpedo boats, and then, of course, the H.L. Hunley, the first combat submarine to sink an enemy warship in 1864. So while the Confederacy could not match the Union Navy in quantity and firepower, and I think in the long run in effectiveness in winning the war, as the Union Navy was, nevertheless, Mallory and the Confederate Navy demonstrated a lot of ingenuity.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple of quick questions here. We're getting near the end of our time, but a couple of quick ones. Were there as many, did the admirals complain that Washington was not meeting their needs and understanding their needs as much as the land generals were doing? Did Did they have a closer relationship? They were happier with what was coming out of Washington, or no?
They didn't complain as much, and they were happier with what was coming out of Washington. And again, I think that credit for that probably does go to Fox and Welles. Welles, well, both Welles and Fox had a lot of influence with Lincoln and with the administration, but Fox was especially close to Lincoln and was able to get, I think, a lot of resources out of the administration. And so the Navy, you don't find the complaints about lack of support from Washington. The one complaint that they did have was something that could not be avoided, and that is the ships were forever breaking down. Hard usage. A steam engine has a lot of moving parts, and boilers have a tendency to rust out or corrode out. Salt water. I mean, it's salt water that they're boiling in these ships on the high seas or on the blockade ships. So the ships are forever breaking down, and so that's the most frequent complaint you'll get. But that's not something the administration in Washington can do anything about. They just have to, keep sending these ships back to the Navy yards for repairs.
You tell the story of the USS Congress, among many other stories in this wonderful book. It just flows wonderfully, and is succinct and compact, and you get everything in, and it's a joy to read, actually, and a lot of information. But you tell about the Congress when it lowered its flag to the Virginia, the CSA Virginia, CSS Virginia, and there were some soldiers on the banks that began firing at the Virginia after the flag was lowered on the Congress, and Buchanan on the Virginia became very angry about that, but they said on shore, we didn't surrender. Now, on the high seas, if one ship surrenders to another, if another one, a compatriot, comes along, it can fire on the ship too. No, is there a difference here? And should Buchanan have been angry about this?
Well, Buchanan claimed that this was a violation of the surrender, but I think I agree with you that the troops on shore hadn't surrendered, and they were actually firing on the two consorts of the Virginia that had gone to take off the prisoners from the Congress. And Buchanan was so incensed by that he came out on deck in the Virginia, picked up a rifle from one of his sailors and started firing back at the soldiers, but then took a bullet through his own thigh, and he was out of action for a while as a consequence of that. Now, I think Buchanan was in the wrong about that. The soldiers on shore hadn't surrendered, but I'm not quite sure of the ethics of all of this. Depends on your perspective, I guess.
I suppose so. I'm going to put you to work here, Jim, for a little bit. We have so many books for you to sign, of course, and people here are waiting as well. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to thank a number of people out there who have ordered books and support us and help bring fine authors like Jim McPherson here. The publishers send them in. Just a few of you, I can't get to all of you, but Peter in Janesville, Wisconsin, Tim and Molly in Seattle, Washington, Gene in Omaha, Nebraska, David in Fairfax, Virginia, Stuart in Sacramento, California. I want to thank all of you for coming in, and you can come up and see Jim afterward. We thank you for being here with us, and of course the staff here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. And so we're going to say goodbye, but